our special guest today, Anna Eskamani, a member of the Florida House of Representatives, representing Orlando and all of us in Florida, in Tallahassee. We first met in 2015 when she was with Planned Parenthood. Remember that. And since she was elected in 2018, we have found her to be a fierce advocate for humanist values, especially for the separation between church and state. Born and raised in Orlando, she's a product of Central Florida Public Schools and the University of Central Florida. Along with her services in Tallahassee, she's seeking her PhD in public administration. And with a track record of kind sacrifice, endless hard work, ironclad values, Anna is known across the state and the nation as a leader who is unbothered, unbossed, and committed to the people of Florida. So please help me.
Jocelyn, also for those amazing updates. I was exhausted just going through these updates. Y'all are a busy group. I love to see it. This is fantastic. And again, my name is Anna Eskamani, and not only am I a state representative, but as Jocelyn mentioned, I am in the process of getting my PhD. I'm actually defending my dissertation tomorrow at 3 p.m. And so I do apologize because as soon as the meeting's over, I'm going to have to run and keep practicing and preparing for that defense at 3. And so I do appreciate the grace that y'all will give me when I do that. And before I get started, I did want to recognize, I think we have 2 amazing women in the space that we invited. That's Stephanie Vanos, who's running for school board here in the district. And then I think we also have Callie Semron, who's running for county commission here as well. And so obviously, this is a C3, apolitical, nonprofit type of space, but I do want to make sure we realize, what candidates care about the separation of church and state. And I will say Stephanie's running against a mom's not so liberty candidate. And so we need to make sure we know who our allies are, who's going to fight for that separation of church and state, and who's going to ensure that every child, every community member can be their authentic selves without Christian nationalism being pushed down their throats. And so with that said, I appreciate you all for being here, and thanks for championing all those values and more. So my name is Anna Eskamani, and I come to you from very, very humble beginnings. And so I want to share a little bit more about how I came to public service. Then we're going to dive into the 2024 legislative session, which just ended, thank God, in March of this year. I will pray on that, just because it was a really tough legislative session. So the sooner they end, the better for the people of Florida. So with that said, I grew up in East Orlando, so over in unincorporated Orange County, and I'm the daughter of immigrants from Iran. My parents actually came from 2 different parts of Iran and met each other working at the same donut shop in Orlando. So a true American love story. My parents were avid practitioners of science. In fact, I grew up watching Carl Sagan Cosmos and going to sleep every night watching VHS recordings my dad captured from PBS. And I would often ask him, Dad, why is the earth round? And, just really was surrounded by using evidence and facts to make decisions. And so I'm really lucky to have been raised in that type of environment. And of course, like so many working families, all I know is hard work. My parents worked multiple jobs to make ends meet. My dad did become an engineer on the weekdays, going to UCF while raising 3 kids and serving as a waiter. But my family still struggled to make ends meet. My mom worked at Kmart, for those who remember Kmart. And my dad picked up a second job at Walt Disney World as a customer service representative to make ends meet. Partly because my brother was actually bullied while he was in school. And so, like any immigrant family, my dad was like, well, you are all going to learn karate. And so, so instead of addressing the bully, he just made us tough as nails. And so that required him picking up a second job to do that. And with that said, my mom actually passed away when I was 13 years old after a long fight with cancer. And that not only, of course, is just a hard experience for any child to go through, but it also put me in a position to decide how I was going to honor her life. What was I going to do to make sure that my mom's story doesn't end with her death, but in fact, a new chapter is born out of it. And so I've made this intentional decision at a very young age to honor her and those no longer with us through action, to do what I can to uplift folks who really should be here with us, who should have that chance to live a wholehearted life, but due to factors beyond our control, don't have the chance to do that. And that's why I do live life twice as hard. I work twice as hard and do what I can to fight for families like mine here in the state of Florida. And that, of course, thank you. Thank you. And that, of course, brought me to my activism, which really first started at the tender age of 17, where I had an amazing government teacher, Mr. Norris, at my public high school. And Mr. Norris was just like your typical everyday teacher, middle-aged white guy who did not have to talk about issues like the women's rights movement or the civil rights movement, immigrant rights movement, but he brought that to life in the classroom. He actually had a theater background, so he would reenact FDR's fireside chats and really bring, government to life for us. And I remember sitting in there reading about Supreme Court cases, processing the separation of our branches of government, the checks and balances, but of course also understanding the Establishment Clause and what does it mean in our nation's history to have been established in an environment where we're supposed to have this separation of church and state. We're supposed to have a First Amendment right to speak our minds and not face persecution for it. So that foundation was essential for me as I grew up and went to UCF myself and started getting involved in different on-campus organizations. I actually first found a home advocating for environmental issues. I'm a big environmentalist. I'm actually a vegan as well. And I do what I can to really fight for the planet, to fight on climate and change and for clean energy. And last week I was at the OUC commission meeting because OUC is going to go after net metering. And so for my rooftop solar folks in the space, that's not good policy for them to do that. So I try hard to champion all those issues on top of everything else. While I was getting involved in environmental space, I also fell into human rights advocacy, specifically for Iran. As you know, Iran is under a theocracy. And so I do what I can to advocate for women's rights in Iran. And of course, most recently under the banner of Zan Zendegi Azadi, which translates to women, life, freedom, which is the fight for those values in Iran. And so during the summer of 2010, I was advocating for many of these issues where I met the college Democrats. And I was actually registered no party affiliation. My parents were pretty liberal. My mom became a US citizen in about 1995, and she would take me to vote with her. But I never really had a political partisan push, if you will. I wanted to decide for myself what my values were. And I wasn't inspired by politicians or celebrities to become a Democrat. I was inspired by watching my peers at UCF who were registering students to vote, who were talking about issues that matter to me as a young person, like reproductive rights, like LGBTQ plus equality, like climate change, like gun violence prevention, like bright futures being protected and tuition not being jacked up. So that's what drew me to get more involved in local politics, because I actually was an international relations double major with women and gender studies. So I was focused on a lot of global women's rights issues, but I fell in love with the work on the ground. And that's where I started, of course, volunteering at Planned Parenthood, the nation's leading provider of reproductive health education advocacy. But before I volunteered at Planned Parenthood, I was a patient. Like 1 in 5 American women, I needed access to contraception. I need access to evidence-based information because at my public school at the time, I had abstinence-only education. And of course, calling that education is a misnomer because it basically came to the point where there was this woman on stage in this auditorium in my high school telling all of us that having sex before marriage was committing a sin. Yeah, in a public school, she said this. She said this in a public school. And then to make matters worse, she stood at the double doors holding a basket of mints, and she asked each one of us to take a mint to make a commitment to her that we would not have sex before marriage. So clearly I did not take a mint, honey, but I did make a commitment. It just wasn't to her, it was to me, that one, I will have sex before marriage because now I'm curious, but 2, I'm gonna do it safe. I'm gonna be responsible. And so abstinence-only education does not work. I'm evidence of that. But I wanted to make sure I was gonna make informed decisions. And so that's how I learned about Planned Parenthood. And I walked into that health center when I was 18 years old, and I felt so anxious, going to my first ever doctor's appointment. And remember, my mom had passed away when I was 13, so I had no one to talk to about menstruation, about dating, and all these topics that you often turn to, a motherly figure to support you with. And so I walked to this health center by myself, feeling very nervous, but I left feeling a sense of confidence and empowerment. And I held this little pill pack in my hand, and there was this sense of gratitude that I could be in control of my future, of my destiny, that I had a choice, and when I wanted to parent. But that gratitude was also matched by a gravity about the realization that so many people came before me for me to have this moment of self-empowerment, and I gotta make sure that other people have it too. And so when I was at UCF and getting more involved civically, I became a reproductive rights champion. I would wear giant condom costumes, and which I am sure someone will find and put on a mail piece one day. But and we would just do everything we could, to practice and preach and educate people on comprehensive sexual health education to make sure that folks know what consent is and are making informed decisions to keep themselves and their loved ones safe. And that brought me to work at Planned Parenthood. A little bit before I graduated, I was offered a job there. I worked at Planned Parenthood for 7 years while getting my double master's at UCF. And during that time, got that exposure to the state legislature that is so critical to understanding how disconnected Tallahassee is from everyday lives, from everyday experiences of what we're going through here in the state of Florida. And that exposure helped me realize 2 things. 1, most of our elected officials are deeply unqualified to do the job. And they fall into politics often by a family tree or immense wealth they've inherited or a desire for power for themselves and not the community. Many times it's just a career move. You have folks who, the second they can leave to become a appointed judge or appointed university president, they will jump at it. So they really look at the legislature as an opportunity of a stepping stone, not so much of helping other people reach their fullest potential. And the other point that I realized is because they're so unqualified, maybe someone like me could do this one day, could be in a place to make decisions for my community. But I will tell you, I still never thought of running for office because, as you can probably expect, not many elected officials look like me. I'm younger, I'm a person of color, I'm first generation, I don't come from wealth. And so the notion of me running for office also just kind of seemed out of the impossible. But then 2016 happened, and I was like, wow, okay, viability looks very different today, right? But I also just felt this sense of duty that I needed to step up because it's not even that 2016 led to the rise of so many things that I oppose. I just didn't understand at the time how we could lose to that type of just vicious and polarizing and honestly extreme agenda. And I realized, well, that's because the two-party system is failing us, and a lot of Democrats are not appealing to the greater community of Americans, that we're missing the mark on not just issues like the ones we champion in this space, but also corporate greed, that too many Democrats just take the same amount of money from corporations and they're not solving these problems because they benefit from the system as it currently stands. And I'm not like that. I don't take money from corporations. I don't take money from FPL, from banks, from private prisons, from all these different institutions, from big agriculture to theme parks. I don't take their money. I don't raise money from those places. I raise them from everyday people. And that allows me to operate not just independently, but to be a champion for things like corporate accountability on tax issues. I'm the queen on closing corporate tax loopholes. I will ask the tough questions in the Ways and Means Committee as the ranking member to make sure they're not giving tax breaks to corporations, but instead we're giving them to consumers, while we're closing the loopholes that corporations have exploited. And so you have to offer this contrast, right? And I knew that running for office, I would have a platform where I could do that, where I can reach redefine what is public service in Florida and help set a trajectory for others to follow. And that's what gave me the courage to run as a first-time candidate in 2018, where we flipped our seat from red to blue, and we've kept it that way now for 3 election cycles. And I'm on the path to do it again because an opponent just filed to run against me on Thursday, and the deadline was Friday. And so we're ready to fight again. But of course, that fight shows itself every day in our communities and in the legislature. So let me pivot to talk about the 2024 legislative session, then I'll open it up for questions. Does that sound good? Yeah. All right. So 2024 was a very interesting session because Governor Ron DeSantis just failed, or shall I say flailed, at his presidential ambitions. And so the prior session, as you likely know, was one of the worst ever in Florida's modern history. We saw a 6-week abortion ban pass. We saw 5 anti-LGBTQ plus bills go into effect. You saw just extreme policy after extreme policy, anti-immigration policy. I mean, it was all designed for Governor DeSantis to try to define himself among his competition in the Republican presidential primary. And so when that effort came to an end for him, he definitely lost some of his gravitas, if you will. And so a lot of the worst bills that were filed this session, I am proud to say that we actually defeated, which was huge. And we should take total credit and celebration in that, because it's hard to find moments to be happy in Florida. So we should honor those moments. What were some of those bills? So that included an effort to define personhood in Florida law. So despite the fact that the legislature already passed a near total abortion ban, they're not finished. They want to keep going. So there was an attempt to define personhood, i.e. saying that conception is life, and thus any type of abortion access would be totally illegal and deemed as murder, right? So this was an effort that the legislature was trying to do. The IVF decision out of Alabama, alongside DeSantis's failed presidential bid, ended that bill. That bill was on its path to pass, and it just abruptly stopped after the IVF decision in Alabama, which speaks to how sensitive many Republican politicians are on this truth, that if you truly are going to be anti-abortion, then you are anti-IVF, which actually the Southern Baptist Church just verified for us in choosing on their platform that they oppose IVF. And I do think it's important for that to be exposed to the greater public of just how extreme these agendas are, and how far those who support it are willing to go to take away our freedoms and take away our rights. There was also legislation once more attacking our transgender community. This trans eraser bill was going to completely go after driver's licenses for our trans community members, any type of name change efforts. I mean, it was just a complete eraser. And that bill passed the House, but not the Senate. And so again, another win for us in stopping that bill. And I do want to also amplify that we had a win in the courts most recently on the trans eraser bill from last legislative session that basically says anyone under the age of 18 cannot access gender-affirming care. And it also created these misleading consent forms to really intimidate and scare patients, to get between patients and their doctors. The bill also prohibited nurse practitioners from providing gender-affirming care. So a federal judge has halted the implementation of that law last week, which is a huge win for our community. The state will obviously appeal. And the reason why I think these two issues are so important and relevant is that oftentimes Christian nationalism is used to pump these bills up. And my colleagues are not shy to do that. I mean, you give them the microphone, they will say it. They will start quoting scripture on the House floor. They will start being very, very aggressive and speaking to their religious beliefs should be written into law. They're not subtle about it. And both these issues impacting abortion access and the LGBTQ plus community, you always see these moments on the House floor. And of course, we push back, but I'm telling you, I have colleagues who are completely reinterpreting the definition of separation of church and state. And this came to a head with the chaplaincy bill. So I'm sure folks are plugged into this, right? So this was legislation, House Bill 1291, that basically wanted to create a system of volunteer chaplains in our public schools. Yeah, and it comes really out of Texas. Remember, a lot of my colleagues believe in original sin, but not original bills. And so they will copy and paste legislation from different states and bring it out of Florida. I'm sad to say that Florida has now become one of the exports of legislation. Like the Don't Say Gay Trans bill started here, but it's being copied in other states. But this was one of those examples where it's not an original Florida idea, but it's coming into Florida. And so what the bill did in its original format is basically force school boards to take a vote on allowing volunteer chaplains to have access to our school kids. And it doesn't even define what is a chaplain. It provides no criteria, no guidelines. You could go online, take a virtual class, pay $300 and become a chaplain, and then go into our schools. It didn't provide any distinction that you have to provide support, for every type of faith background, nothing like that. And of course, the bill was branded as a means to address the gap we see in counselors at our schools, which is a complete insult. I mean, to think that chaplains are even if you have a certified chaplain, right? To think that they're even qualified to fulfill the responsibility of a counselor is a complete insult to the practice of mental health and just the importance of ensuring that when you have a child experiencing a suicidal ideation, that someone qualifies there to help them. I mean, that is a situation of life and death if you don't have certified professionals there to meet the needs of our children. So maybe we pay our teachers better and pay our counselors better than try to, quote, fill the gap with folks who are not only unqualified, but clearly there for a different agenda. Yeah. And so when this bill came before us, obviously one of our responsibilities when we're in the minority caucus, and for those who don't know, Republicans have a supermajority right now. So there's only so many tools we have to try to stop bad bills. I always break it down between delay, amend, destroy. and by the way, I'm a big Star Wars fan. So when I walk into the Capitol, I am walking to the Death Star. I know that every single day. And so I have I'm in my X-Wing, aka my Honda, and I'm driving into the garage. And so delay, amend, destroy, what does that break down to? So because legislative sessions is 60 days long, time is on your side. If you can delay a bill from moving forward, you might be able to kill it. It's a really small might, but time is one of your friends in advocacy. And so you try really hard to run the clock, you try to filibuster if you can. I will tell you that the Florida House Republicans have changed the rules on us. We're not even allowed to filibuster on the House floor. In fact, everything is time certain. So we have timed debate, we have timed amendment presentation. So when we filed 50 plus amendments on the 6-week abortion ban last session, we were given a minute and a half to present each one. And so even when we file an excessive amount of amendments, which I'm proud to do, the reality is that they're only going to give you 90 minutes to do it. And that is in the House rules, which requires 2/3 to approve. And because they have a supermajority, they were able to do that. Now, these rules do change every 2 years, so we can get out of this situation and go back to a regular minority. They actually might not be able to do that again. But for now, that's the reality of our circumstances. So the delay tactic is limited, but still an important one. Amend. So amend speaks for itself. You try to amend legislation to make it less harmful, but also amendments are messaging tools. We also want to get you on the record voting for an amendment that will make you look bad, because they often do that to us by giving bills these flowery names that we have to vote no on. So we also get them to vote no on exceptions for rape and incest on an abortion ban, right? You have to get these folks on the record demonstrating to us their extremism, so hopefully that can impact them on the campaign trail. And then destroy. Destroy, destroy, destroy. So we're going to ask the tough questions. We're going to highlight that you don't know your bill, how bad your bill is, and we're going to carry the Constitution with pride. And I actually have a copy of the U.S. Constitution in my desk drawer that was gifted to me my first session. And though I'm not allowed to use props on the House floor, I'm holding that Constitution, and I'm referencing it because I'm surrounded by folks who took an oath to uphold the U.S. Constitution, yet they continue to fail to do that every single day. And so with this bill in particular, of course, we hammer them on the Establishment Clause. Separation of church and state. You can't do this. Other courts have said that. But the response that I got, and I'm not even being dramatic here, is that the separation of church and state in actuality was about keeping government away from censoring the expansion of religion in our institutions. Like, this is the new definition coming from the right on the separation of church and state. And it is scary, y'all. Like, it is unsettling because they're not lying. Like, they believe that that's what it actually meant, that we got it wrong all these years, that actually we need more Christianity in our institutions, not a separation. That is how they've interpreted the separation of church and state. So obviously it's very difficult to argue with someone who doesn't lead with logic or history or precedent. So I have to remind myself every single day on the House floor that it's not always about persuading my colleagues in the chamber, it's about persuading the folks who are watching from outside, who are gonna read about this in the newspaper, who are going to maybe catch a clip on Instagram, because we have to really help inspire and educate the everyday person, the everyday voter, because the folks in this chamber oftentimes already know how they're gonna vote when they walk in. And so this bill did pass, but it did have one amendment, which actually is important, that we were able to get into the bill. Basically, when I spoke earlier how this bill originally mandated school boards to have a vote, whether yes or no on this program, we were able to push to get that out of the bill. So there is no required vote a school board has to take. So if you have a good school board, they will not vote on this issue. And this program will never be implemented in Orange County Public Schools. But it goes back to having a good school board, right? And ensuring you're engaged at that local level of school board elections, because that path is there now. I suspect there will be school districts who do it. But right now in Orange County, there is no interest because there are no votes for it. So at least we got that out of the bill. But it's another warning of how important it is to be engaged at every level of government and you know, of course, protecting what we have here in Central Florida. So I want to talk about, there's so much we're going to talk about, right? Property insurance reform that didn't happen, to, you know, issues like the social media ban. And so I want to create space for all those points and questions. The last issue I want to highlight is one that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but again, is very important to our values of separation of church and state. And that is the call for an Article 5 convention. I don't know how many folks have been following this, but Project 2025, which is, you know, part of the Trump administration's agenda to weaken the federal government and to rewrite the U.S. Constitution. And Article 5 convention is a part of that. So we have not had an Article 5 convention since the creation of the U.S. Constitution. And when Article 5 convention would essentially open up the floodgates for Pandora's box, if you will, is to allow for there to be revisions of the U.S. Constitution. Article 5 in the U.S. Constitution is only about 100 words. So part of the concern a lot of us have is that it's not clear at all what a convention would even entail, who could vote, how to choose delegates, what happens if people leave the delegation, the convention meeting. And it's been a push by conservative think tanks or organizations to have states pass Article 5 convention requests. And this year, Florida passed 4 separate Article 5 requests. And the challenge too is Article 5 doesn't say that when you call a convention, you only have to talk about one topic. And this was an issue of debate that we had in the legislature, because the calls for Article 5 convention don't seem to intersect with separation of church and state. The calls for a convention that came out of this year's session was term limits for members of Congress, a balanced federal budget, and, you know, other types of issues that I think at first glance, you know, an average voter might say, oh yeah, we should have that debate, right? But their problem is that if you call an Article 5 convention, you potentially can do anything you want. You could rewrite the entire U.S. Constitution. Corporations could influence delegate members to get what they want out of it, right? Those with money, those with wealth could influence this process. And there's not yet enough states to call an Article 5 convention, but we're getting we're getting very close. I think there's only maybe 7 more states that are needed. And this is a part of a long-term conservative plan to rewrite the US Constitution. So if you don't know about Article 5 and just the work, the money behind it, Common Cause is a national organization that's been kind of ringing the alarm bell around this. And Florida, as I noted, passed 4 separate Article 5 requests. And so it's not an issue that gets a lot of attention, but 4 or 5 years from now, we could be looking at Article 5 convention if people don't wake up and really take this issue seriously and realize how important it is. I know the US Constitution is not perfect, but we do not have people of the caliber of those who created it to tweak it. And the other part too, by the way, is that we do have a path to amend the US Constitution. I mean, obviously the ERA is one of those issues where we have a path to amend the US Constitution. So I'm not saying we shouldn't amend it, but we shouldn't rewrite the whole damn thing. And Article 5 opens up the door for everything to be rewritten. If you go through the traditional path, right, of a constitutional amendment like we're doing with the ERA, obviously there are clear roadblocks we're facing out of Congress, but that process does focus on one issue versus opening up the door for everything. And so I do want to flag the concerns in the Article 5 convention and make sure it's on your radar. So with that, I'm going to step back and see what questions folks have. And again, I know there's so much more we can talk about, and I barely touched the surface, but I know I'm among a very informed community. So I want to open up the door and see what questions folks have. And again, thanks so much for making the time for me as well.
The first question that I have is, have you tried to use the force?
Every day, David, every day.
Hi, Anna. On Friday, I heard a great interview. You were on NPR, and one line really stood out to me. You said, our budget speaks to our values.
Right.
So I thought that was a very wise and succinct line. And I was thinking about humanist trends that we have today, not just in Florida, but in the world. What can our group do to help you bring more humanistic values to legislation? Or once legislation is passed, how can we help implement that? And I say this not just because of Central Florida, but last week I was in New York City for a humanist conference, and the number of initiatives around the world for business and government is amazing.
Yeah. I love that. I love that question. And for more context too, that interview on our local NPR station was about Governor Ron DeSantis and his veto of the budget. So long story short, our one constitutional responsibility as state lawmakers is to pass a budget. Florida's budget is about $114 billion. And just so you reference, about 37% of that is federally funded. So we do require federal support to balance the state budget. The other third is going to come from use taxes, i.e. sales taxes, when you go and buy items. That goes into Florida's coffers. And then the other third is trust funds, which is typically also a use tax. That includes when you buy gas, you're paying a gas tax that goes into a transportation trust fund. The document stamp tax when you buy a home is supposed to go into a trust fund. And so out of this budget, we fought for different programs to be funded because, again, a budget speaks to our values. And Governor DeSantis, with his veto pen, vetoed $6 million that was going to help make sure that our public schools had access to tampons and pads and other menstruation items. So he didn't think that it was worth spending $6 million out of $115 billion to make sure that our young people have access to menstruation items, which is very important. I mean, I did not have access to period products because my mom passed away. My period had started after she passed away, and it was very embarrassing and difficult to navigate school without those resources. So he just vetoed that completely. He also vetoed, by the way, the entire budget silo for arts and culture funding, which is connected to a fascist agenda. And I'm not going to get onto a conspiracy theory soapbox here, but I will say that when you have a state that censors speech, right, that goes after diversity trainings and rewrites history to say that enslaved people benefited from slavery, when you have politicians become university presidents, right, and censorship of higher ed, and then you cancel arts and culture funding, what is that? What's the actual end game here, right? Even the social media ban. I'm not going to stand here and say that we don't have issues with social media. Absolutely we do. But when you take away access to information for young people, but you say you can read these books but not those books, what is the end game here, right? When you ban social media but you pass a communism class legislation, which happened this year, now our students have to learn about the victims of communism, like we're back in the Cold War. When you have certain speech being emphasized and other speech being taken away, it is not a coincidence. It is 100% intentional. But to the heart of your question of what groups can do to lead by our values and show up, outside the walls like this, right? I think a part of it is, and you're kind of already doing this with all the activities that you have, right? But I think it is having a continued public face for what it means to be a humanist, right? What does it mean to be a free thinker? And I just mentioned the arts and culture cuts. Help fill those gaps. Be a sponsor in apolitical spaces, right? Sponsor organizations that reflect your values, like the Orlando Gay Chorus. Sponsor all of our arts communities. Arts is a space of free expression. It's often the space where, for the first time, some people feel safe expressing themselves, right? But think about, how can I show up in my community where people, in areas where I'm not always expected to lead with my values? And I do think, obviously, not every person has resources financially to do that, but you can volunteer. You can sponsor a volunteer day at Second Harvest Food Bank, right? I mean, our homelessness community, many of our best service providers are folks who lead with some sort of religious foundation. It would be awesome if we had more organizations that were secular in helping the homeless, right? And so I would really think about where can I plug in society in places where maybe I'm not as expected, to make a difference through my values. So that's what I would offer as advice.
Thank you for that. We actually do more than we've talked about, but you've given us some good ideas to do more. So what's your question?
So Governor DeSantis and his genius slashing of our budget.
Right.
Slashed 10,000 families with disabled children and families that really needed that money to support their abilities to get their children forward. What are you doing about that?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I mean, the reality is that unless we have to educate voters so they know that. I can't tell you a number of times where a constituent will come to us with a state issue, but they think the party responsible is the Biden administration. And again, I'm not going to stand here and defend the Biden administration. There's a lot of concerns that I have, but I will say that because there's been a nationalization of our politics through media, most folks don't even know a state government exists or that a state government is intersecting on these issues that impact their lives. And so part of what I do is I educate folks on understanding how do you read a budget and how do you distinguish between the state budget, your county budget, your school board budget, and a federal budget, right? Yesterday, I got a bunch of these emails from different state agencies requesting budget amendments. And it gets very wonky, don't get me wrong, it gets very complicated. These are emails that most people just delete, but I'm like, I'm gonna read these. And so, I'm scrolling through, and out of 10 budget amendments, I would say at least 8 were connected to money that came from the American Rescue Plan, which was, one of the large COVID relief packages, right, that we don't even talk about anymore. But ARPA money is still being flooded into our communities. We don't always know it, but it is. And so one of these projects is to help Eatonville. It's gonna be $250,000 to go to the Eatonville CRA from the American Rescue Plan. DeSantis is gonna say that's his money, right? So I think a part of it too is when it comes to proactive things out of the budget, we have to also highlight where that money actually came from and who should you thank for it, and just kind of educate the voters on that piece. On things that we lose out on, same thing, to educate folks and realize we had money coming down to help children with disabilities, and it's not Biden who vetoed it, it was Governor DeSantis. And to your question, what can we do about it? More practically speaking, I hate to say it, but there's not a lot we can when that money is gone, right? So a lot of folks have asked me, do we have recall power in Florida? We actually don't have a recall mechanism in Florida. We do have impeachment, but it requires 2/3 of the legislature to impeach. So that's not gonna happen. And to override a veto, whether it's budget or policy, it also requires 2/3. So this reinforces the importance of voting, and especially voting local. I know that a lot of folks feel demoralized by the state of our politics today, which again, I empathize with. However, I always want to stress to folks that don't give the national politics all your attention, because your vote makes a huge difference, especially on the ground. And yes, I always practice bottom up. I think it's so important to inspire folks to come out to vote on local issues and local candidates, which, by the way, this year we have abortion on the ballot, we have recreational cannabis on the ballot, and these were really hard fights. I mean, we had to collect 1 million verified signatures within a 5-month period to get abortion on the ballot this year. And we should not take that work for granted. I mean, it was, and every roadblock you can think of was put in our place, and we still did it. So I obviously, I think it's the education piece, but also not being demoralized by those moments. And as I mentioned earlier, what can we do as a community to fill in those gaps? So on the arts budget, I'm already talking to both Orange County and the city of Orlando, because obviously we're not gonna be able to fill all the gap of money that was lost. What can we do at a local level to help fill in some of those gaps for our local groups? Winter Park Playhouse, I'm on the board, lost $65,000. We were going to get into our budget from this state program. And so to also leverage whatever local relationships you have, whatever private partners that want to help. I think part of it too is getting creative. And at the end of the day, we keep us safe. We can't count on someone to save us. So we have to also work together as a community to fill in when those gaps exist.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
I want to be cognizant of your time. You said about 3:15 before you have to get to your 12th event of the day.
Sounds great. Really just my dissertation, but yeah.
You will definitely pay.
I can answer a question too, I will. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Hi, you just touched on the subject I'm considering here. Yes, we are scheduled to have a vote on women's right to an abortion
Right.
in the Florida Constitution, 60% required.
Correct.
Very narrow vote by our conservative Supreme Court.
Right.
But I've been picking up whiffs in the paper lately, and I'm not clear on this, so it's not fair to you. But it seems to me that there are some maneuverings going on to disqualify that amendment, to not have it on the ballot or
Right.
make it fail.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. There absolutely have been many just meticulous and well-funded efforts to remove Amendment 4 from the ballot, 100%. None have been successful, and the avenue to remove it is close to zero at this time. What they are trying to do now is impact the fiscal statement associated with the amendment. So let me go back a little bit to explain what that means. So the legislature has made the process of constitutional revisions by citizens much more difficult. Surprise, surprise. So there are 3 ways to amend Florida's state constitution, okay? One way is every 20 years, a committee is convened called the Constitutional Review Commission, and these are individuals appointed by the governor, the speaker, the Senate president, and the Chief Justice to make revisions to Florida's state constitution. But those revisions have to be presented to the voters. In all 3 of these examples, voters get the final say at 60% right now. So that's one way Florida's constitution can be revised. Every 20 years, you have this process. The last one just happened in 2018, so we don't have to worry about it for another decade or so. But that is one way. The second way is the legislature puts before the voters a question to amend the Constitution. And this year, you will have several legislatively pushed constitutional amendments, and I would vote no on all of them. And I will tell, when we get closer to November, we'll do an event, and I'm sure there'll be voter guides, and we'll tell you, recommended votes. But the legislature, with 2/3, can also put before the voters different constitutional suggested revisions. That third way is citizen-led. So that is what Amendment 4 is. We crafted the language, we collected the signatures, raised the money to collect the signatures, because these ballot initiatives are expensive. It was nearly $18 million to collect the 1 million signatures. Yeah, just to collect signatures. It used to be something that volunteers could do. I don't know if y'all remember in 2010, the conservation amendment that Legal and Voters helped champion. I was a 20-year-old helping collect those signatures, much younger days. But back then, you didn't really have, it really was citizen driven. Now, because legislature has put all these requirements on it, you have to have resources. So it is expensive and difficult, but nonetheless, we did it. But then the Supreme Court was asked by Ashley Moody to challenge the language of our ballot initiative. So that's what you alluded to, where it was very close, right? It was a 5-4 decision to allow it to continue. That is not a process that has to happen. That was Ashley Moody basically saying that our language was unclear, and that led it to go to the court. Again, another reason why the attorney general elections matter. If you don't have a good AG, I mean, she could be doing so much on consumer protections and going after monopolies, but no, Homegirls is trying to take away our reproductive rights. Drives me crazy. But so we won that fight. The next fight that we're in right now is the fiscal impact statement. So another effort the legislature did is required that any citizen-led ballot initiative has to have this fiscal impact statement. And it's another tool to dissuade people from voting yes, because they basically want to attach something that says this is going to cost you money, this might raise your taxes. And like, there's no way allowing us to have abortion is going to raise your taxes, guys. But that's what it is, right? They're just trying to craft language to dissuade a voter from voting yes. And we won in federal court. The federal judge said, yeah, this impact statement doesn't make sense, but that's what is being appealed right now. And that's probably that's the latest news, if you will, around Amendment 4. And so we're going to have those legal battles. But again, at this point, there's no path to remove it. There is this path to try to mislead people, which is going to be the entire operation, of the No on 4 campaign. But it will be on your ballot this November, regardless of what that fiscal impact statement is. I do want to let y'all know that there's about 6 anti-abortion organizations that are leading the No on 4 campaign, if you will. They're all led by men, and all of them. And a huge source of their funding for some of them is the Catholic bishops. So the Catholic bishops are funding this, they're called like Doctors Against 4. So they're trying to have these different, political organizations that kind of hold a facade of opposition, but they are pumping money into them. The Liberty Council is another organization that's one of the No funders. Florida Family Action, if you know who they are, they're one of the lead organizations pushing no. And so it's going to be a very expensive initiative, but one that requires all of us to talk about, to post online, to put signs up. The Yes on 4, we will win, but it's going to be really close, because 60% is not easy, and it will be at the margin. So we have to really make sure every vote counts and be aware the opposition is going to be funded. It's not going to be, a one-sided campaign, if you will. They're going to fund opposition, so we have to be ready for that as well.
I was going to ask about. For 4, will the language on the ballot be clear when people read the title? And who decides on these misleading titles on ballots that people don't know what they mean unless they know in advance?
Yeah, it's a great question. So that was the question before the state Supreme Court, right? So Ashley Moody said that the language wasn't clear, but the language is originally crafted by whoever's leading the campaign. So Amendment 4 is a committee of multiple organizations that many of us know, like ACLU, Planned Parenthood, Florida Rising. There's also smaller organizations that make up the steering committee, like Women's Voices Southwest Florida. SCIU is now on the steering committee. So the original language was really crafted with the help of attorneys from across the country and attorneys right here in Florida. And so that language was clear, and even the conservative justices in a narrow majority agree that it was clear. That will be the text before the voters. So they really can't edit the text be misleading, but what they can still edit, as we talked about, is this fiscal impact statement, which will be on the ballot as well. So that's being contested right now. The real challenge, right, is not necessarily what's on the ballot, it's what people hear before they get to the ballot. Because the rhetoric coming from the right now that DeSantis has already been called out on by, truth meters, that kind of stuff, is that tattoo artists will be able to provide abortion. Yeah, I can't wait to see those deals, right? Where it's like, end your pregnancy and get a tattoo. But he's been pushing that. I've also seen, of course, that, rhetoric around gestational age. And it's important to stress that the language in this ballot initiative is actually up to the point of viability. Of course, there would be exceptions for issues like rape and incest, but the viability language means that this is not going to be abortion access, anywhere near the third trimester. I mean, viability is going to be typically 22 to 24 weeks. So it's also important to state the facts to people, what this actually means, because what the right is doing is saying, all the rhetoric that this is, you'll be able to, basically give birth and then terminate, which is, that's not how abortion care works in the first place, but that's the misinformation they're relying on. So I actually think it's even more important to talk about this beforehand and to really educate voters before they even get to the ballot. Because unfortunately, when we talk about low information voters, right? Voters who are not as engaged as the everyday person because they just got a lot of stuff going on, right? They're more vulnerable to misinformation. Voters who English is not their first language. I mean, there's going to be so much advertising in different languages scaring people. And so, of course, the Yes on 4 initiative is raising the funds to have multimedia communications and be at the doors, be on the airwaves, be in your mailboxes. But again, there's nothing more powerful than word of mouth. There's nothing more powerful than knocking on doors and talking to people. And so really encourage folks to get civically engaged. And every level, every person who votes for me is going to vote Yes on 4. And so we integrate that. We actually do phone banking now every Monday for vote by mail renewal, but Yes on 4 is our main hook, if you will. We ask the voter about Amendment 4, and then we ask them, okay, I'm glad you're supportive. Have you renewed your vote by mail ballot yet? And so we're using that to also inspire people to come out and vote. So thank you for the question.
You can certainly count on us to inform all of you about this as well. So I've got 3 more. But,
All right.
There were 20,000 voters in Orange County alone who signed a petition as a registered voter who are actually not registered. The petitions were rejected.
Right.
So this person said that we have the list and they're going to start, local groups are going to start writing postcards. It seems like if that's really true, that the local groups writing postcards, which are expensive to mail, is a very small effort. Is this something you have heard of? And is there a bigger effort to get everybody who signed these petitions and possibly purged or something? They think they're registered.
Yep.
Not.
Yep.
Wouldn't that be a great source of voters?
Yeah, 100%. So there actually is a database. So it's hard, right? Because you have to. There's just so much data out there, and it's always hard to know which data is best over others. I know that right now, the Democratic Party in Orange County has a database of potentially unregistered voters. I say potentially because no list is perfect. And there is an effort to phone bank through that list. And whenever you have I don't know if anyone here works in data, but you're always trying to match up data, right? So if you have the list of, folks who signed a petition, but it wasn't counted because they weren't registered, you try to match that with other lists out there. So you actually can get a phone number, not just an address. And so the postcard effort is valiant and very important, but I also think it has to be tiered with different approaches. So I know that the DC here in Orange County, we have a list of unregistered voters that we're to call through, and not every number will work, but you have to call through to see. And we're also doing voter registration at community events. So yesterday we had a series of Juneteenth events across Orange County and Central Florida. So I know my team, we were at multiple events doing voter registration and vote by mail renewals. So you always have to approach this from multiple layers. And even when you register someone, you have to make sure they vote. So the good thing is if you can make that contact is then you can build a relationship with that person and help them learn the ballot, help them feel inspired to vote. There is good statistics to say that if you help someone get registered to vote, they're more likely to vote that first election versus be passive about it. But it has to be multiple tiered operations. And the challenge with postcards and this demographic of voters is that they tend to be very transient voters. They tend to be renters, younger people, folks who just are not always in the same location. So for postcard operations that I've done, it can be a little frustrating because you get a lot of mailbacks. You get a lot of folks who just don't live there anymore. So you do have to find other ways to contact them. And maybe that means finding them on Facebook and sending them a message, right? And hoping they see it. So you do have to kind of approach it from multiple levels. But I do think that effort is good. It's better than not reaching out to them. But I would encourage trying to find other ways to contact them if you can. And I know the Democratic Party is working on that. I started a voter reg organization about 3 years ago called People Power for Florida. And we're doing voter registration everywhere, on campuses, at clubs, at sporting events. We're actually at city soccer games now. And we're organizing a series of what we call dorm storms. So when students go back to school, we basically set up tables by the dorms, and they think they have to check in with us, which is adorable. But we're able to leverage that and say, are you registered to vote here at your current address, right, as they move into campus. And so you have to approach it from multiple levels. But yes, that work is happening, and it just needs more resources. It just needs more dollars. I mean, and that's the biggest challenge we have in Florida, is that there has been a major divestment of political dollars in our state since 2020. And so part of my work is I try to raise funds. I try to, I spoke at a conference last year in Las Vegas. I was there for 24 hours. I did not get married. But I flew in and flew out to serve on a panel about the South. And the whole point of the panel was, don't forget about the South. And so I was there for Florida. We had a Texas person, a North Carolina person, and a Georgia person was a moderator. And it was a room of political funders and nonprofits and, folks that do this work nationally. And we were basically painting the picture for why it's worth investing in a state like Florida. And if when a state is struggling, you don't leave them, you help them, right? But so much of the national money is dictated by competitive federal races. And I do think the Rick Scott race is getting more competitive, but obviously when you're a national organization, you're looking at the 50-state map and you're thinking, okay, where will our dollar be more effective for the federal races? And they don't so much focus on the state itself, what's happening in the state of Florida. And I mentioned the $18 million that we raised to get on the ballot. 90% of that came from Florida. 90% came from Florida. We raised that money from Florida because national groups kept saying we couldn't do it. I can't tell you how many calls I had where they said, well, that's nice, Florida, but y'all can't do it. You don't have enough time. And then once we collected petitions, they were like, you'll never get through the courts. Once we got through the courts, they were like, well, you still can't do it. I was like, what? I did everything you've said. So it is hard, but I do think that the success in Ohio has really inspired more people to believe in abortion as a winning issue. So because of Ohio's win, we have been able to leverage more support to the point where Governor Pritzker in Illinois, his political committee, gave Florida millions of dollars of support, I think $500 million. So, obviously we need more, but I'm sorry, $500,000, not $500 million. But I wish he has that money. We're trying, but I think it'll be a $90 million campaign for Amendment 4. So we have to keep raising money, and that's what we're doing.
Freedom